We wanted to talk about power, was it?
Yeah, let's talk about power.
Because there's going to be an upcoming course on power, and I will be preparing for that course, and I will be doing more on this channel speaking about power. I will also be publishing more on my Substack, and this is so far the only proper way to support my work. So anyone wanting to do this, check out my Substack, support me there. And yes, so James, how have you been? Well,
I
do you
have
have
been
yeah,
I've been brilliant. I've got a great way to start because I actually want to pull apart what your angle on power is. Like what is it that you're making a course about? Obviously Foucault is the first thing that comes to mind as the most obvious person that talks about power for someone that's into postmodernism, but what else do you envision?
right. I'd like to characterize the study of power in being represented in two different camps, and one would be this more systemic analysis of power, which I would count Foucault under, but also Luhmann, if you know it. Luhmann also has written some about power.
So I've only come to Luhmann through his note-taking system, and I've just discovered that he's an amazing sociologist whose views I actually think I'm really going to love. But
Right.
it's a funny, very angular thing because I've just been hearing so much about the Zettelkasten, and now that I've started doing the physical thing, everyone's constantly talking about Nicholas Luhmann, and now I'm like, oh, this guy's actually saying some shit that's interesting. It's not just some random sociologist. So
Right,
I have
right.
no idea what he's actually talking about, but it's yeah.
I can recommend the YouTube channels Carefree Wandering.
Oh yes, yeah. What's
He
his
has
name
a
again? Muller, is it?
Hans-Georg Müller. He's a friend of mine, and he's got a great series on media theory, and the last few parts of that series have been on Luhmann. I read his Reality of Mass Media as well, which was pretty interesting, especially because it's not like, I would just say, super critical. It's not focused on, like, for example, with Manufacturing Consent by Chomsky, where it's mainly focused on critiquing. It's generally focused on just analyzing. It's the reality of mass media. But that's besides the point now. I was talking about the more systemic theories of power, and the way Luhmann kind of plays into this is that power is seen as a sort of systemic medium. So you could say that there is a particular system, and a particular system always is operationally closed, meaning you can look at power within economic systems, within political or ideological or military systems. And the four I've just mentioned are the networks of power that the sociologist William Domhoff speaks about when studying power. And you can look at each of these systems, and operationally closed in this case means that they're structurally coupled. Power in one domain can correlate with power in another domain, but it doesn't directly operate on one another. So you can't win a battle in terms of military power, for example. You don't automatically win a battle if you are the richest person. For example, if you have the highest capital accumulation, it probably helps to be able to afford more weapons and all that. It's correlated, structurally coupled, but it's not the same rules. Like you are most powerful if you have the highest market cap, let's say, depending on your mode of analysis of economic power. But that doesn't necessarily translate one by one into military power. For example, that system applies
So
to.
sorry, so there was economic, military, political was the third, was it? And
Yes,
what was the fourth domain?
ideological.
Ideological. Okay, interesting.
Yes.
Oh, that's a nice spicy one to throw in for a fourth.
Yes, it's a
Yeah.
nice spicy one. Yeah, you could throw in like something like a technological as well, but technological, you'd have to build a careful case where it doesn't end up being just a special case for economical or something like that.
Yeah, because I mean, who do you think of as being technologically powerful right now? Who is not either politically, where that power isn't really a political thing or an economic thing or a yeah, it's almost more the means rather than the yeah, it's a tool rather than the thing itself.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so if you look at power as a medium in terms of system theory approaches, then you look at one of these systems, for example, let's take military power or political power, and there's a certain decision. So it's the medium is basically determined by its indeterminacy, or its openness, because a medium has degrees of freedom, meaning it can either go down one path or another, right? It can either contain a certain configuration or another configuration. That's kind of what is meant by a medium. It's something that holds other things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so if there's different configurations, let's take a very simple one: war or no war, right? You have a button that declares a war and one that remains a peace. And this situation is not determined. So they're in the particular system, let's say the political system, both is possible. There could be a war, there could be peace, there could be no war or negotiation, whatever. And whatever then ends up reducing that indeterminacy to an actual choice of these two, then is making use of power. Power is this medium that carries these two choices and then leads to universally valid decisions, right?
Okay, can we ground this in an example? So let's take the political sphere. What would be an example of something that would take us from indeterminacy to determinacy there?
Well, it depends obviously on the systems you're looking at. If you're looking at institutions, for example, you take the Kremlin in Russia, right? You take different institutions in Russia, and then you have the Kremlin, right? You have an indeterminacy, invasion, non-invasion, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're not having a political discussion. This is just neutral analysis.
Where does a special military operation come between invasion
Yeah.
and non-invasion?
I just thought maybe I should have taken a different example.
It becomes even more vague. Yeah.
Should have
Well,
taken.
let's take a hypothetical example where Russia was to invade Kazakhstan or some shit, and
Right.
there's a choice to invade or not invade. Yeah.
Right. Invasion, non-invasion. Yeah. So if there's a certain institution that basically reduces this medium, the degrees of freedom down to a single one, which is invasion, then you can trace back and deduce that that institution wields power, or wielded power in that instance, right?
So let's say the Americans during the Cold War launched a load of nuclear missiles at the Soviets, then they've more or less limited their options to, well, it's mutually assured destruction, so we have to also press this button. Would that be a kind of a, but then you trace back okay, what caused the Americans to do that? And then you're following the chains of power, is it?
Yeah, in that sense, that's actually an interesting conclusion you'd have from that. In that sense, then during the Cold War, the Kremlin would have a certain amount of power over decisions in Washington and vice versa, right? Because they'd both be respectively obliged to follow, with the mutual.
Yeah, they're tied together in some kind of power game.
Yeah. So this would be one way of conceptualizing systemic analysis of power. Obviously, if you focus more on, let's say, the type of system instead of like the power networks, like economics or politics, but you're focusing more on the respective components of the system. So if you're looking at institutions, or are you looking at individual people, are you looking at parties, then you'd get more into Foucaultian territory, where you would look at, schools and, these societies of discipline,
institutions,
disciplinary institutions, schools and mental asylums, hospitals, factories.
Prisons,
yeah.
So okay, what part of the course is this? So you're saying that one part of the course is looking at systemic forms of power, is it? What other?
The other one I would refer to, there's many ways to call it, but I would refer to it as Machiavellian theories of power. That one is different in its approach, as I'd say systemic theories, they kind of work as most scientific systemic theories, where they start with certain axioms, definitions, assumptions, and then try and deduce some sort of model. Whereas I would say Machiavellian theories, maybe I'm misunderstanding the methodology, how people arrived at them, but they look at historical patterns in the way power plays itself out. And so you could say in some way you could also call it Nietzschean in a way, because power becomes something, undefined and metaphysical in a sense. But you kind of look at, patterns and cycles throughout history. So there's this famous iron law of oligarchy, where there's always been an elite, and that elite kind of cycles through the ages and through the rise and fall of empires. And I would say that iron law of oligarchy would be one example of a Machiavellian theory of power, right? The reason I'm saying Machiavellian is because there's this the Machiavellian approach, I would say, and it's also inspired by James Burnham, who wrote that book, The Machiavellians, referencing people like Pareto and Mosca, that he'd count on among those as well. What they look at is basically just, we can't tell you exactly what power is in terms of some definition, but we can tell you how it works and how it historically grows and functions and what it does. And that helps you understand what's going on now, right? And
so is power will? Is it influence? Like what? Yeah, is that going to vary between that seems like that's a deep rabbit hole. I kind of want to just get more of an idea of the structure of this thing before we go down on what power actually is. So this is like is it a 6 or 8 week course? Is that what you did the last time?
Yeah, basically.
And do you plan on doing like systemic for like half it, or are these going to overlap, or what's the?
Yeah, so I would ideally do systemic and the Machiavellian approach, and then try and tie them together, weave them together to some extent. I think the sort of synergy like that is the most fruitful and most powerful. And there is certain points where you can tie them together, specifically if you bring in Carl Schmidt. I don't know how familiar you are with Carl Schmidt.
Not at all.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily consider myself a Carl Schmidt scholar either. However, there's 3, you could say, slogan-like concepts that are good to know and remember from Schmidt, because he's very influential, and even the fact that he was a member of the Nazi Party doesn't seem to cause much damage to his legacy, because
What was it like Luhmann? So Luhmann was a Nazi, but he was like a Hitler Youth, so it doesn't really, it's kind of like if you were brought in as a teenager, can you really be considered a Nazi? Like, was Schmidt older, or was Schmidt was like proper, was he was
I think Schmidt is less ambiguous. Yeah.
Right.
Schmidt is less ambiguous. It's like Heidegger, I guess.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
He said some things.
Yeah, he said some, but just like with Heidegger, I think their influence has been so large that even devoted anti-fascists or devoted scholars today still study them. Their impact just can't be denied. And the 3 slogan-like things, and I think Schmidt scholars would probably say I'm selling him short here, but one important part is that the most important political distinction is that of friend and enemy. That is one important slogan of his, you could say, because essentially what a Machiavellian approach would imply is that there is no such thing as just pure power that's not being exerted, right? That's not being enforced in some way. So power has to, it's like you could compare it with physics. There's energy has to perform work for you to measure it, right? To see it. What is energy if it never performs any work, right? If there's and it's the same thing with power. Like, what is power if it's not actually being used, if it's not being exerted on others? And in that sense, so the understanding is, if you have an elite, then that elite employs a particular political formula, according to Pareto, which is, you could call it an ideology, you could call it a national civil religion or something, which justifies the power being used against the enemy of civil society, enemy of the state. That whatever that political formula implies a certain enemy, right? And the belief in that political formula by the wider society justifies the exertion of power that is currently held against that threat, right? Or against that enemy. And that brings us to the second principle in Carl Schmidt, and that is the sovereign, which is defined as he who decides over the state of emergency.
Mm-hmm. Oh, right. Okay. Yeah.
Right. So there's certain laws that, wider society has to stick to, but the true sovereign power can supersede that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that is that state of emergency is actually more common than you think. So it's kind of paradoxical to say the state of emergency is quite common, but the state of emergency or using a state of emergency to enforce whatever is way more common than people think.
Do you mean more common in we talking the scale of years or decades or centuries?
It depends on the impactfulness, right? Like, for example, introducing passports was an emergency measure during the First World War, and we're still stuck with them, right? Or a lot of the
COVID is a good example of there was a level of there was a lot of state of like the lockdowns, and there was a lot of pulling out the emergency card.
Right.
But is that, I'm trying to think of other examples. I guess Americans with the after 9/11 and all the, what would they call the Patriot Act, and now we still all get searched in airports because of this shit.
Yeah. I was gonna mention that one. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so his second point is about the sovereign being the person who has the thing in the state of emergency. So is that an emergency is to be understood as happening more regularly than you might expect?
Right. Yes. And the third one, which is kind of the basis for the title of one of his works, which is Political Theology, that is that our state institutions are just the secularization of religious institutions, right? So
say that again. Our state institutions are secularization of religious institutions.
Yeah. So in that sense, the state more or less, or the sovereign power of the state more or less becomes God, so to say, because God is that which can override the law, right? There's natural law, but there's also God's will in that sense, right?
So this isn't just a theological religious map over. This is because in that sense you could say the Pope, but you're actually going to more of a natural extent of so when you were talking about the religious map over, I was thinking, okay, so are we talking about the Christianity and the Pope is the head of this, and so we're talking about this hierarchical move over and the power that comes with that? But you're suggesting something, or Schmidt is suggesting something even
I don't
more
like
there?
I said, I haven't studied him in depth. I have read the Political Theology, but it's been a while. I don't want to mischaracterize him there. But what
he was a Nazi. You can mischaracterize him as much as you want. I'm pretty sure there's a carte blanche in this society to say whatever the fuck you want.
actually, good point. Yeah. But I mean, the crucial distinction we have here now between this and the systemic theories of power is that the systemic theories of power, you kind of have to predefine some sort of system where power represents the medium, right? You have to say, oh, we've got the economic network that runs according to these rules. You have these, right? Whereas the Machiavellian theory doesn't require this. The Machiavellian theory just needs requires basically to say a minority rules over a majority. And this is kind of like a fractal pattern. Like within that minority, there is another minority that rules over the majority.
Which is a Pareto distribution of geometrically increasing
something like that. Yeah,
geometrically smaller amounts have greater and greater power down the chain, right?
Yeah, that's why Pareto is counted among one of the Machiavellians, right?
That makes sense.
And also, you get that in something like George Orwell's 1984 with the inner party and the outer party, right? You've got the proles and then you've got the party, but then even within the party, you've got the inner party and the outer party.
So we're talking about the pyramid shape of the very neat pyramid of hierarchy on which the head of the, but then I guess it's three pyramids because of the three, well, Oceania, is it Eurasia, right, and whatever the other one?
Yeah. At the top, you get Big Brother, right? But that so yeah, so essentially, Big Brother that's actually a good metaphor. Big Brother is this, quasi transcendent, undescribable power. And that differentiates it obviously from a systemic, more rational analysis of power. And but it nonetheless claims at least to be historically accurate. It nonetheless claims to describe power accurately historically, right? That there is a certain elite, regardless of whether it's from an economic network or like whether the people there are power have gained power through the economic network, the ideological, military, whatever. There is an elite, and the type of elite is irrelevant. That's why the biggest opponents of elite theories are pluralists, right? That want to look at interest groups and want to look at, complex. They're like they want to build up this whole complex system,
an ecosystem of power rather than a hierarchy.
Yes, right. And so there is these people in between, which I find an interesting bridge, such as William Domhoff, who I mentioned earlier. He is an elite theorist, but claims there's 4 networks, and the elite kind of accumulates out of these 4 networks, right? But yeah, that is kind of, it leads to more and more. If you go down that rabbit hole, it leads to more and more questions. The question is, okay, if there is an elite within the economic network, does it necessarily overlap, or does it necessarily converge with the elites of the other networks, or can they be separate?
Yes,
these are questions. You can see that with Elon Musk, for example. He's a good example of someone who's probably in the economic elite, but not necessarily in the ideological elite, or
but you could see the move of taking over Twitter as definitely moving much more in that direction of, okay, we can now gain some level of much more ideological power, but also much more maybe political power through that.
Yeah.
So is the goal of the course to try and come to an understanding of power, or what is the overarching goal of it?
The goal of the course is, of course, to usher in a global revolution.
Cool. Let's start now. I've got a pitchfork.
Yeah, I've got the torches. At least I got some candles.
It's going to be a half-hearted revolution.
Yeah, that'll have to do.
Yeah.
Maybe a lighter and deodorant. But
that was the modern take on it. Well, the torch you can carry around and smell good while burning the world down.
Yeah, exactly. No, I think so. There is this notion of the political illusion. There's a book by Jacques Ellul. I'm a big Ellul fan. I don't know if you're familiar with Ellul at all.
Never heard of him, no.
Yeah, he was like a French Christian anarchist, something really fun like that.
How do you spell his last name?
Ellul. And yeah, I can recommend The Political Illusion by Ellul. One of the, I'd say, more impactful works on me there, and almost all of what I've spoken about has kind of played into it. There's another work by this a YouTuber, academic agent, called Populist Delusion. I think that is in a similar vein. It's not as long. It's a thinner book. But like the titles are kind of similar, right? You've got the political illusion and the populist delusion.
Yeah.
And yeah, so they kind of the titles speak to why I'm interested in making a course like that, and that is that there seems to be a particular illusion about power. So power has a particular tendency of creating a mystique, and I'm not entirely sure to what extent it's gotten more extreme in our time, or to what extent it's even for the first time fully mysterious in our time, thanks to the age of mass media, right? That's
What do you
where,
mean by mysterious? Or yeah, the mystique here.
well, you could say the mystique is, first of all, how it actually comes about. You know, you have, let's say, imagine yourself seeing the Emperor of Rome or something like that, right? So that's just a human, right? He's a human like you and I in the basic sense, right? Obviously, people wouldn't believe it back then,
Mm-hmm.
but you know, he's just standing there, and if you dare to do anything to him, you'll be killed. There is thousands of people there listening to that person, thousands of people there willing to sacrifice their life to that person, right? There's something eerie about this, right? I mean, there's something, you know, for an average person that doesn't have this, that isn't born into this, there's something odd about it. If you suddenly walked out your house and there was people willing to die for you, you know, that's,
Do
I don't know,
you
I don't
not
know
do you
how
not have
famous you are.
that?
I don't know how famous you are.
You just wait till you get to 5,000 subscribers. That's when it really starts.
Yeah. Yeah, so it is, there's, you would be weirded out by that, right? It would be a very strange feeling, right? There's something odd and, you know, magical about
I
it.
don't think. Yeah, the funny thing is, I actually don't think you would, unless you were really just dropped in it, unless it happened like overnight.
Right.
But I think, yeah. So there's something that's coming to my mind of like the neurochemical side of all this, where they did an experiment on, I think it was vervet monkeys, and they measured the serotonin of all the monkeys, and then they took the alpha monkey out, and his serotonin levels like plummeted, and all the serotonin levels in the group were going haywire until a new alpha emerged, and his serotonin levels came up, and then the rest of them started to reorganize, and then you reintroduce the original, and then it all goes back to the start. And it just seems like there's this scorecard that's been kept neurochemically that's tracking this, and there's all these associated traits with serotonin. The impulsiveness, the self-evaluation is extremely high, and there's an actionness. And it seems like there's something, it almost seems like a social glue that's causing it. So I think if your serotonin levels are high, then it's not going to seem odd to you that people are behaving in this way. It might be because you're going to have the neurochemical cocktail that's going to make this go, of course, I am where I am. Naturally, people would act a certain way. So
Yes.
I'm not actually sure. Yeah, the internal psychology of it, I think the power shapes you, and there's a neurochemical evolutionary component to it that isn't just institutional and cultural, but that is kind of deeply wired. And so there's a way that power and the role and the individual, because like the it's not the person of the emperor that really those people are willing to die for. And maybe this is what you're getting at with the mystique. There's a role there. There's something that the person is kind of, there's a cloak that they're wearing,
Yes.
which is attached to. And is that what you mean by the mystique?
Yes. So there's this book which is kind of a parody by Thomas Carlyle. I don't know if you've ever.
I'm aware of Carlyle, but not.
Yeah, he's written this book called Satyrs Artis, which is a parody kind of on German idealists. He speaks of this guy called von Teufelsdreck, which just kind of means the devil's manure or whatever.
Right, yeah.
But it's and he's like a philosopher of clothes, and he speaks about how, you know, we are just, you know, mortal exchangeable pieces of flesh that just come into being and then rot away, but the clothes we wear, they represent the actual kind of abstract the abstract society that underlies, you know, the cycles of people going in and out of professions and in and out of their you know, jobs and duties and everyday life, right? And I suppose there's that to that. You know, you have this, the clothes make the emperor, right? Yeah, you have this,
Which sounds ridiculous, but I actually think that to a degree that is
yeah,
actually true. Yeah.
right, yeah. So you have this kind of institution where this, you know, you could say this human individual that is the emperor right now just kind of fills the
There's an
cloak.
abstract thing that is greater
Yeah,
than the emperor.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, and I'd say the political illusion stems more from being outside of power. So what you just said may still apply with the comparison with the monkeys. If you're not the person with the high serotonin, right? If you are, you know, it reminds me more of like a social setting. So you have people that are more dominant and more confident and more popular and more, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're not that, you know, it is like mysterious to you how that person does it. It seems almost magical that people just are drawn to them.
Right.
Right?
Okay. Yeah.
There's what
Yeah.
they call a gravitas to them, right?
Mm.
Or Gustave Le Bon would call it the nimbus, right? Uh, and this I'd say is even more reinforced on the one hand through civilization with humans, because you have that situation where someone can have the power without you ever meeting him in your whole life, right? Which is different from the monkeys, right?
Say that. Sorry, go on.
The emperor can have that power
Mm-hmm.
without you ever meeting the emperor in your life, right?
Mm-hmm.
That probably wouldn't work with monkeys, right? Right. So
Yes, the serotonin would have to be probably or that would have to be directly socially mediated, but that seems like a limitation of their linguistic capabilities more than anything.
right, but I mean, there is that is also another source of that political illusion and that mystique. It is someone turns up and they have power in your local place. They have power because they represent the emperor who you'll never see,
Mm.
right? Which is a certain level of mystique, right? It's
So
just
where is the
the
mystique
emperor.
situated is because yeah, I'm having trouble locating the mystique. Is the mystique in your reaction to this person who has the power, or is it a mysticizing of power itself, or what is where is the mystique of power in that? So this will say the governor comes and the governor has power from the emperor. Where is the mystique there?
Well, the mystique on the one hand is what we've talked about just now, the mystique in that person, but the it's also that kind of spellcasting magical formula that enables them to grant this authority, to gain this authority just by, let's say, by repeating or maintaining the uh the what's it called, the mandate or delegation they have obtained from the emperor and by consequence the gods, right?
Mm.
And that's, you know, mirrored as well in the divine right of kings, and these things. And I would say, just on top of that, because Jacques Ellul is especially a philosopher of modernity and a critic of modernity, is that the political illusion has intensified to some extent, because you could say in some respect it has been honest to some degree. Like the emperor kind of just, you know, the power, if you say the emperor is in power, in many times that would have been accurate, roughly, right? That would have been
Mm.
the
There was a
case.
nakedness to that power.
Right, there was a nakedness to that power. The emperor could go somewhere and have someone executed on a whim, right? And the difference now is that you have, in the age of mass media, you have a shift of the source of information to a technological network that has started with the printing press but has kind of accelerated with radio, TV, and the internet, right? And on top of that, and that allowed kind of the maintenance of this so-called, you know, Enlightenment era liberal republic, liberal democracy, right? Which is a very, you could call it, it is a kind of meme. It is a kind of idea that is being sold, which doesn't it cannot be, as it is like a cultural agreement or a cultural meme. It's not something that's objectively set somewhere, right? There's there's some connection maybe to the Attic democracy in Athens back then, or the Roman Republic, but these connections, are in some sense superficial. There's very big differences. And if you want to look at where power resides, there's many different institutes and people that have studied it. It often is. It often leads the superficial view you'll get from mass media leads you to the wrong place, right? You will look for power in today's age, and represented members of parliament, for example, in your local country. And many people nowadays realize or have the intuitive sense that can't be it, right? That's where you get
now, is that due to a decentralization of power, or do you think that that's due to a hiding of, is there a sort of a disguise of where the power truly lies?
Yeah, I would say it's a paradoxical, like, double development. Marshall McLuhan used to say that, I think, was it one form of technology was uniting and decentralizing, and the other one was fragmenting but centralizing, which sounds like they're opposites each time.
What did he mean by that?
I'm not exactly sure, but like he was referring to old media in the first case and new media in the second case, right? And so I'm just making comparison. I'm not bringing McLuhan in here, but in a sense it has been way more centralized, and in another sense way more decentralized, right? Decentralized in the sense, as we've just said, that it's kind of become it's kind of become that these networks actually have different branches. Like you look at economic power, and there is a very separate domain of Wall Street and whatnot, whatever you want to call among these things, banks and Wall Street, and a separate domain for parliament and for government and all that, and a separate domain for your defense ministry and your defense institutions. And a lot of them, they have grown. There's international institutions. You could say they've decentralized in some sense, but then on the other hand, the rise of you could say that the new Western empires, the British and then the American empire, was actually the rise of the modern rational absolute state with a full monopoly on power, a full monopoly on violence, which arguably was not the case in pre-modern times, right? Perhaps not everywhere. There's very centralized empires in antiquity, but in that sense, you had less centralized structures in the Middle Ages, with guilds having power over trade, which churches often couldn't fully infringe upon. Whereas any such rules and laws and regulations are now entirely in the responsibility of the state.
Of course, in Europe, it's a little bit, with the EU, it's a bit who's got who's got the regulatory power here, but I guess it's still ultimately statehood. Yeah, it's interesting. I'm still thinking about the McLuhan thing, because there's something in